Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Indie Pop Girl, the podcast for music chat, new releases, hidden gems, and nostalgic deep dives. I am back, and it's time to introduce my new series, the Indie Classics. I have picked 6 indie records from my own record collection. There will be a good mix from all the decades, but they all hold a very special place in my heart. If you love all things indie, then stay tuned as you don't want to miss this. To kick the series off, I'm going to be discussing Head Music by Suede from 1999. Head Music is the 4th studio album by English alternative indie rock band Suede, which was released on the 3rd of May 1999 through Nude Records. The record is notable for the band opting to work with Steve Osborne on the production and mixing duties. Previously, they had worked with Ed Buller, and this decision was a bit of a controversial one at the time, as Steve was known for his work with the Happy Mondays, New Order, and U2. And he is also known for remixing, so working with Suede seemed a bit of an odd choice. And Head Music was a complete departure to what Suede had delivered previously. Yes, the guitars are still there, but at its core, Head Music features a more electronic sound, completely new ground for them. Steve was assisted by Ben Hillier, who was involved with the engineering on the record. And if there are any Depeche Mode fans listening to this episode, will be aware of Ben and his incredible work. Together, I think they really helped to shape the record, having that distinct balance of incorporating the electronic elements with live instrumentation is a tricky process to execute. To me, Head Music still sounds fresh and not dated in the slightest. It was fascinating going back to this record, and I had so much fun revisiting the songs again and picking up things in the production that I hadn't noticed before. Now, I was not aware of this at the time, but Head Music was plagued with difficulties during the recording. Brett Anderson's addiction to crack cocaine and the desire in wanting to make a Prince record often resulted in creative differences which caused a lot of studio tension. Keyboardist Neil Codling was also going through his struggle with chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a miracle that this record even exists. But despite the rising tensions, addiction, and crippling health issues, Head Music was well received and landed at the top spot on the UK Albums Chart. And it was the record that made me finally take notice of Suede, and I instantly became a fan. I can't believe that I've not talked about Suede yet, but here we are. Suede have always been on my radar during my teenage years, and I remember when Animal Nitrate dropped back in 1993. It was a song that I instantly loved, but they kind of slipped through the net in the following years that followed. I was concentrating on following other artists during the 90s, and even though I was aware of the big hits from Suede, I never really dipped my toes into one of their records properly until the arrival of Head Music in 1999. Now, I'm going to sound really basic here, but the song that kicked it all off for me was She's in Fashion. An unpopular opinion, maybe, but I fell in love with that song immediately. That song was everywhere. MTV2 had it on heavy rotation, even VH1 played the video, and every clothing retail store I walked into was playing it. If it wasn't for Brett's unmistakable vocals, you would not even think it was Suede. But when I found out it was actually Suede, it was actually quite jarring for a bit, but the sound and the production was so addictive and it really got me intrigued for the record. And that's the key thing about this era. I have mentioned in my previous episodes that I had a bit of a breakthrough moment in my teenage years when my musical palette and tastes were changing. I was gravitating towards sounds and genres that I hadn't before, discovering new artists and really widening my musical horizon. My first love is pop music, and I will always have a soft spot for pop music. And Head Music, in part, is a pop record. It's also a pop record drenched in sex and sleaze, which is typical Suede. And having Steve Osborne in the production chair, I feel was the perfect choice. You guys know by now that I am a sucker for synths and electronica, and this record was the perfect balance of indie and an electronic production. It really is no surprise how much I love this record. Not everything works, and it's far from perfect. I'm looking at you, Elephant Man. But I truly have so much nostalgia and lovely memories attached with my late mum listening to this record, and just that summer in 1999 in general. It is the perfect candidate to kick off this series. It might not be the obvious choice for a Suede record, but I had to choose this as part of the series because it is the Suede record that I've returned to most over the years. I also saw them live for the first time during this tour, and I have not stopped seeing them live since. They are truly electrifying live, and Brett, God bless him, is still as energetic as ever. I really don't know how he does it. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, I will not be playing clips of the songs, so if you are curious, then please support the artists I cover by streaming, downloading, or buying physical copies. Thank you. Track 1, Electricity. I don't know if you'd agree, but this track still sounds like classic Suede to me. At the time, I don't think I consciously made that connection, but going back to Head Music years later and then diving deeper into the rest of their discography really made it click. Once I discovered this album properly, I ended up going backwards, listening to everything they'd done before it, and I've pretty much been following them ever since. So now, hearing Electricity, it feels like a really clear bridge between eras rather than a fresh start from scratch. You can hear the DNA of the previous record coming up all over this track, which makes sense considering how successful that album was for them. That was very much their pop record, full of big hooks and melodies, and Electricity carries that same sense of immediacy and accessibility. It feels designed to grab you straight away, which probably explains why it was chosen as the lead single. It introduces the album with confidence and gives you a pretty clear idea of the kind of energy you're stepping into. That said, this one took me a long time to fully warm up to, especially compared to She's in Fashion, which clicked for me much more quickly. I still find that the chorus is repeated a little too much throughout the song, and sometimes it slightly overstays its welcome for me. But I do really appreciate the instrumental break in the middle because it actually shifts the mood and gives the track some breathing space. It stops things from becoming too predictable and adds a bit of texture to what could otherwise feel very straightforward. Overall, I still really like Electricity. It's energetic, it's punchy, and it definitely does its job as an opener. I just sometimes feel like there is potential to push it a little further or give it a bit more variation. Even so, it sets up the record nicely and works well as a way of introducing this particular Suede era before the album starts to stretch out into some more interesting and varied territory. Track 2, Savoir Faire. I've always found myself wondering what the public reaction might have been if Suede had released this as the lead single instead. It feels like quite a bold choice compared to Electricity, and I think it would have definitely divided opinion even more than it already does. The lyrics in particular received a lot of criticism at the time, and honestly, even years later, that conversation hasn't really gone away. I do understand where that comes from. Lyrically, it can come across as a little lazy or lightweight compared to some of Brett's more vivid or emotionally sharp writing. But musically, I absolutely love this track. The instrumental is doing so much heavy lifting here, and that's really where the song comes alive for me. The production is interesting and textured, and I think Steve did an awesome job pulling all of those elements together into something that feels rich, colourful, and slightly unexpected. There's a great groove running through it, some really tasty percussion bubbling away in the background, and of course, those brilliant guitar lines from Richard Oakes that give the track its character and movement. It's also pretty obvious that Brett was leaning into a bit of a Prince inspired moment here, both in the delivery and the overall vibe. And honestly, I kind of love that. I'm always drawn to bands and artists who aren't afraid to step outside their comfort zone and try something completely different, even if it risks polarizing people. That willingness to experiment is often what keeps a band interesting over the long term. When I first went into head music, I did so with a fairly clean slate, apart from knowing a few of the bigger hits. I think that really helped me embrace the record with an open mind, without too many expectations attached to what Suede should sound like. Because of that, tracks like Savoir Faire landed really naturally for me rather than feeling jarring or out of place. I also think it works really well coming straight after Electricity. It keeps the energy flowing but immediately introduces a different texture and attitude, which starts to show the range of what this album is going to offer. Within the wider context of the record, it just sounds right. Slightly strange, slightly playful, and a really fun early moment on the album. Track 3, Can't Get Enough. This was the fourth and final single from the album, and honestly, my god, this track is just ridiculously catchy. It's one of those songs that gets lodged in your head almost immediately and refuses to leave. What I really love about its placement on the album is how well it works, being sandwiched between some of the more electronic and experimental moments. Because of that contrast, this track absolutely comes alive. It feels brighter, punchier, and even more immediate when you hear it in that context. It's also a song that really explodes in a live setting. If you've ever seen Suede perform this one, you can feel the energy lift in the room almost instantly. On the track, Simon's drumming really takes centre stage here, especially when paired with Matt's bass. There's such a tight, driving rhythm section pushing the whole track forward. Richard's guitar sits perfectly on top of that, complementing everything without overpowering it, adding colour and momentum rather than clutter. One of my favourite little details is the production choice to include what literally sounds like scissors as part of the track's texture. I honestly don't think I've ever heard a rock song use a sound like that so prominently before. It's slightly weird, slightly unexpected, and a bit of a what the fuck was that moment? But somehow it all works. And in a way, that tiny detail really sums up head music as a whole. You never quite know what they're going to throw in next, and that unpredictability keeps the album feeling playful and exciting rather than safe. Lyrically, yes, it's a bit daft in places, but I'm more than happy to forgive Brett for that because his vocal performance completely carries the song. He always manages to inject so much personality, character, and emotion into even the simplest lines. There's a theatricality and warmth to his delivery that elevates the track beyond what's on the page. Sometimes it's not about lyrical depth, it's about how a song makes you feel. And this one just feels joyful, energetic, and irresistibly fun. And it's fucking fantastic. Track 4, Everything Will Flow. So, this was the third single from the album, and once again, it feels like another clear change in direction. When you look back at this period in the band's history, there was so much going on behind the scenes, creative differences, personal struggles, and tension within the group. The list really does go on. Knowing all of that now, I actually think it takes some serious guts to put out a song like this in the middle of all that chaos. There's a vulnerability to it that feels brave rather than safe, and I really respect them for leaning into that instead of playing it comfortable. I've often wondered whether the title itself is a bit of a metaphor for what the band were experiencing at the time. Almost like a mindset of just riding things out, letting everything flow, and accepting that whatever is going to happen will happen. There's a quiet sense of surrender in it, but there's also a subtle thread of hope running underneath, which makes it feel emotionally rich without being overly dramatic or heavy handed. Even if this isn't your favourite Suede record, I genuinely think it's hard to deny the beauty of this track. The string arrangement is absolutely gorgeous, and the instrumental as a whole is just so finely balanced. Everything feels exactly where it should be, nothing overcrowded, nothing fighting for attention. The production complements Brett's more understated vocal performance perfectly, allowing the song to breathe and unfold naturally rather than feeling rushed or forced into a big moment. Placed after the manic high of Can't Get Enough, this track feels almost like a deep exhale. It's calmer, more reflective, and carries a slightly hopeful tone that gently resets the mood of the album. It gives you space to pause and really take in what you're hearing, which makes it even more impactful. If you've seen the eye-opening documentary that Sky Arts did a few years ago, it went into some heartbreaking detail about the making of this record, and parts of it were quite hard to watch. Knowing what they were dealing with at the time definitely changes how this album lands emotionally. Listening to it now hits a little differently, especially with that context in mind. But at the same time, I'm so grateful that through all of that pain and instability, they were still able to create something as quietly sublime as this track. It feels like a small moment of calm carved out of a very turbulent chapter for the band. Track 5, Down. This might be an unpopular opinion amongst the fan base, but I honestly think that Down is one of Suede's best songs. The way they incorporate electronic elements into the live instrumentation on this track is just genius. It never feels forced or gimmicky. Everything blends together so naturally. And Brett sounds absolutely out of this world on this track, and his somber lyrics complement the music perfectly. I think a lot of us can probably relate to this song at some point, and it explores the theme of depression in a really honest way. It's drenched in melancholy and sadness, but at the same time, touching on the Sky Arts documentary, Brett was talking about the inspiration about this song, and hearing this song again, knowing all of the backstory and what was going on at the time. It's just so sad and it's so heartbreaking. I won't go into the detail that Brett goes into, but what I will say is if you've not seen it and you are a big Suede fan, I urge you to watch this documentary because it is absolutely fascinating. And to hear this song with all of the emotion behind it, it's just breathtaking. As the song builds, it feels like the light is trying to break through. There's this tension between heaviness and hope running all the way through it, which makes it feel incredibly human and emotionally real. For me, Richard's guitar solo at the climax almost feels like a metaphor for that glimmer of hope. Like there's a moment where things might lift, even briefly, but then right at the end, as the track fades out and Brett comes back in, it feels like a reminder to the listener that the darkness and the depression hasn't fully disappeared. Those closing piano chords almost suggest that the weight has settled back in again. It's bleak, but it's also very realistic. It's such a powerful piece of songwriting, and the execution is immaculate. Everything, the atmosphere, the performance, the lyrics, the dynamics, works together to make this one of the most emotionally striking moments on the record for me. Track 6, She's in Fashion. So, this is the song that really started it all for me. The second single, which felt like it was absolutely everywhere that summer back in 1999. And I couldn't get enough of this track at the time. Excuse the pun. Coming straight after Down, this track works so beautifully in the flow of the album. It almost feels like the flip side emotionally, where Down is the big emotional moment drenched in melancholy. She's in Fashion feels bright, warm, and unmistakably summery. This is clearly their big pop moment on the record, and it absolutely earns that status. That intro alone is just gorgeous, and I still get goosebumps every time I hear it, even all these years later. Once again, I love how they blend the electronic elements with the live instrumentation. Here it's just with ease. The acoustic guitar sitting over the roads and the verses is pure magic for me. It adds softness and warmth without ever feeling cluttered. The production feels light, airy, and beautifully balanced. And listening back to this track again now in 2026, I've realised just how well it's aged. It doesn't sound dated in the slightest or a product of the late 90s, which is such a testament to how thoughtfully it was put together. I'll always have so much love for this song because it's tied to such a specific and happy time in my life. It reminds me of a simpler time just coming out of my teenage years. I was working in retail, spending all my money on clothes, makeup, and music, and just fully leaning into that phase of discovering who I was and what I loved. I also shared my love of Suede with my mum, who absolutely adored Brett, and like me, she loved this track, and the one that follows especially. So, I just want to take a small moment here in this episode to remember my late mum. This album holds that extra layer of meaning for me because of those shared memories, and I'm dedicating this episode to her. Track 7, Asbestos. Apart from my mom absolutely loving this track, I've always personally found Asbestos to be a bit of an odd one. When I first heard it, I didn't really get it at all. It felt quite different to what I expected from Suede, and it didn't immediately click in the way some of the other tracks did. But, I stuck with it, and over time, I've come to really appreciate the instrumental and the production for what they are. There's a lot going on under the surface here, even if it doesn't instantly grab you. It's got this slinky, late night kind of groove that honestly doesn't sound like much else in their catalogue up to that point. It feels darker, looser, and more atmospheric. It's definitely got an experimental edge, but there's still a real sense of movement and flow running through it, which keeps it engaging even when it's pushing outside their usual comfort zone. Looking back now, it actually reminds me a little of something that could have appeared on their Sci Fi Lullabies B-Sides record. A lot of that material on there was more off center and a bit out of the box. And Asbestos shares that same slightly left field energy. It feels like a band allowing themselves space to try ideas that don't necessarily fit into a traditional single or obvious album highlight. It's not a track that I actively seek out on its own very often, but within the context of the album, it really does make sense. In many ways, it feels like it quietly sets up the second half of the record, which leans more into experimentation and mood compared to the more immediate first half. But what I will say is I absolutely adore the melody in the chorus. It is so smooth, and I never really noticed until listening back to this record in preparation for this episode. It is such a fucking earworm. That chorus just goes round and round in your head. And I do love the synth work from Neil on this track. It does complement everything beautifully and adds a lot of atmosphere and texture. I also noticed listening back again that Matt's bass is also really prominent here and does a great job of anchoring the groove and giving the song its sense of movement. Even if it's not a personal favourite, I really appreciate what it brings to the overall shape and pacing of the album. Track 8, Head Music. The title track, and in my opinion, it is an absolute banger. There's a real sense of playfulness running through it, especially that cheeky line of, "So give me head" in the chorus. It's clever, it adds a bit of mischief to the record, and it's very clearly not meant to be taken too seriously at all. It feels like the band loosening up and having some fun, which is always something I enjoy hearing. Once again, you've got those electronic elements sprinkled through the live instrumentation, and I really love how confidently they lean into that on this album. It's something I hope they revisit again in the future. I know they've leaned more into a punk direction in more recent years, which has its own energy and edge, but I'd personally love to hear them bring back some of this electronic texture alongside strong melodies and atmosphere and just enjoy themselves with it a bit more. The production on this track is also really strong. Everything feels well balanced and intentional. Brett never sounds drowned out by what's happening instrumentally, but at the same time, he's not straining or shouting over the top either. The music almost carries him along rather than competing with him. The instrumental takes control in a really satisfying way, creating this thick, immersive sound without becoming overwhelming. It's one of those tracks that just feels confident and fun, and it reinforces that sense of unpredictability that runs through head music. Just when you think you've got a handle on where the album is going, it throws something like this into the mix and keeps things fresh and exciting. Track 9, Elephant Man. So we've reached Elephant Man, which was written by Neil, and this is probably one of the more divisive tracks on the album. At the time of release, we didn't really have the same level of online discourse and social media commentary that we're surrounded by now. But over the years, this track has definitely become a less popular choice among fans. For me personally, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I actually think the verses work quite well. There's a mood and an atmosphere there that feels consistent with the experimental side of the record. But the chorus structure has always felt a little clunky to me. Doesn't flow quite as naturally as some of the other tracks on the album, and it slightly disrupts the momentum rather than elevating it. I do think the production itself is solid though. Sonically, it sounds good and fits the overall palette of the record. But my main hesitation really comes down to its place on the album, especially when you consider how strong some of the B-sides from this era were. There were so many great tracks recorded around this time, and I always found it a little odd that this made the final track list while some brilliant songs didn't make the cut. Tracks like Leaving, God's Gift, Crackhead, Killer, and especially Jubilee were all overlooked, which still surprises me. Jubilee in particular is such a strong song. That chorus is so fucking addictive, and it would have fitted into the album tracklist perfectly, both musically and in terms of energy. When you listen back to the quality of those B-sides, it does make you question some of the sequencing and selection choices for the final album. So, while I don't dislike Elephant Man, it's not one I gravitate towards very often, and it's probably one of the few moments on the record where I slightly wish a different decision had been made. Track 10, Hi Fi. Oh, here we go. Now, this is probably one of the most experimental tracks on the record. And yes, I know I sound like a stuck record, but I'll happily admit I'm a complete sucker for electronica, synths, atmosphere, and this one absolutely ticks all the boxes for me. Holy shit. It's dark, it's moody, and it leans fully into that shadowy, immersive sound world that I'm always drawn to. I love how the chorus suddenly opens the track right up, especially with Simon's booming drums coming in so powerfully. It gives the song this huge sense of space and drama, and it just sounds fantastic when it hits. There's such a strong dynamic shift between the tension of the verses and the release of the chorus, which keeps the track feeling alive and unpredictable. Around this time, a lot of artists were experimenting with electronic textures. Sometimes it worked brilliantly, and sometimes not so much. But there's just something so magical when Suede lean into this side of their sound. They manage to keep the emotional weight and melody intact while still pushing into more adventurous production territory. One track this always reminds me of is the version of Europe is Our Playground from Sci Fi Lullabies, which is one of my all time favourite songs in terms of both mood and production. To me, these two tracks feel like they belong in the same universe. They share that same sense of nocturnal atmosphere, emotional pull, and slightly otherworldly beauty. And honestly, if you're making a playlist after this episode, line up Europe as Our Playground straight after Hi Fi. Trust me on this one. You can thank me later. Track 11, Indian Strings. This is easily one of my favourites on the record. It's just so beautifully arranged and composed. The way the bass and the percussion settle in first, and then Richard's guitar gradually weaves its way in. It is absolutely gorgeous. Everything feels deliberate, layered, and really immersive without ever becoming too busy or overcrowded. I'm honestly not even sure whether the strings here are real or synth based or a bit of both, but either way, it sounds wonderful. There's a strong Arabic flavour running through the melody and atmosphere, which gives the track such a distinctive identity within the album. It feels cinematic, transportive, and slightly hypnotic in the best possible way. Lyrically, Brett goes to some darker places here, which creates a really striking contrast with how beautiful the instrumental is. His vocal performance carries so much emotion and intensity. And knowing now about his struggles with drug addiction during the making of this record adds another layer of weight to how this track lands emotionally. It makes the vulnerability in his voice feel even more raw and real. Tracks like this and the one that follows are proof that even during a turbulent and difficult period, the creative magic was absolutely still there. I'm so glad these songs made the final cut because they're some of the most emotionally rich and musically adventurous moments on the album for me. Track 12, He's Gone. This is another one of my absolute favourites on the record. On the surface, it feels quite classic Suede, but there's so much going on beneath the surface in terms of production and atmosphere. Brett's vocal performance here is probably the strongest on the entire album for me. There's a vulnerability, control, and emotional weight to his delivery that really cuts through. And that chorus, holy shit, my god, it is just gorgeous. It's one of those moments where you almost don't want the song to move on because it feels so satisfying to sit inside that melody for a while. It lingers in the best possible way and gives the track such a strong emotional payoff. I know this album often gets criticised for its lyrics in places, but I honestly think the writing on this track is really strong. There's clarity, feeling, and intention behind it, and it lands in a way that feels sincere rather than overworked. A ballad done to this standard is honestly stunning. It shows just how powerful simplicity can be when everything is executed properly. I also love how Richard's guitar never fully takes over here. It stays understated throughout, even when the solo arrives in the outro. Instead of dominating the track, it quietly adds texture and atmosphere, serving the mood rather than pulling focus. It's a really tasteful piece of playing that perfectly suits the emotional tone of the song. If you're someone who's never quite connected with head music, I would urge you to give it another chance. Tracks like this prove that there's so much depth and beauty here, and that many of these songs still stand the test of time far more than they're often given credit for. Track 13, Crack in the Union Jack. I've never been entirely sure what they were aiming for by ending the record with this track. I mean, it's fine. It's not a bad song by any stretch. It feels more like an interlude for me, but it feels like it's something that should have been sent straight to the B-sides rather than closing the album out. I've read that Brett has since said he regrets that decision, and honestly, I completely understand why. I've always felt that the album should have ended with He's Gone and then transitioning into B-side Seascape. I think that would have such a satisfying ending. And I think ending the record that way feels like such a natural, emotional conclusion. It's beautiful, reflective, and leaves you sitting in the feeling of the record rather than slightly disrupting it. Ending it there would have made a much bigger impact for me personally. What do you guys think? I honestly feel like this album is crying out for a revised track listing, a slightly tighter version that could elevate it even further. Sometimes just one sequencing change can completely reshape how a record lands emotionally. That said, despite its flaws, I will always have a huge amount of love for head music. This album ignited my love for Suede and sent me down the rabbit hole of discovering their incredibly rich and impressive discography. For me, they really are national treasures. Their journey as a band has been fascinating. The highs, the struggles, the reinventions, and the fact that we still have them creating and performing in 2026 honestly feels quite miraculous. It speaks volumes about their resilience, creativity, and sheer strength as a band. Head music might not be the fan favourite, but it grabbed my attention back in 1999, and this record has stayed with me all these years later. It's grown alongside me, picked up new meanings over time, and continues to reward revisits. And I have no doubt it'll stay with me for many years to come. So that brings me to the end of my deep dive into head music and my first episode in my new series. When head music was first released back in 1999, the record actually debuted at number one on the UK albums chart, becoming Suede's third and final chart topping album. That's pretty remarkable considering how divided opinions were about it even then. Listening back now, you can hear both sides of that conversation, the risks, the bold ideas, and the imperfections. And that's part of what makes head music such a interesting record to revisit. And it wasn't just in the press. Fans were split too, which is one reason you'll still hear some people call it the weird one in the Suede catalogue. The weird one with the striking artwork, art directed by Peter Saville, just captured a moment in time. I remember seeing them live on the Head Music Tour in Wolverhampton back in October 1999, and what a show that was. Songs like Electricity and She's in Fashion hit so hard live, and even the more experimental tracks took on a new life. But I'll always remember when they played Metal Mickey, Wolverhampton Civic Hall just came alive, and being on the floor so close to the stage and the band is something that I will never forget. Even with its imperfections, Head Music holds such a special place in my heart. It sparked my love for Suede, opened the door to discovering their wider catalogue, and soundtracked a really formative time in my life. That's the magic of music, isn't it? It becomes woven into your memories, your relationships, and your sense of self in ways you don't always realise until you stop and reflect. And as I mentioned earlier, this episode is dedicated to my mum. We shared such a love of music, and Suede in particular, and thinking about those memories still brings me so much comfort and warmth. In a strange way, revisiting this album feels like reconnecting with those moments all over again. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Please follow me on Instagram and Threads at the Indie Pop Girl. If you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you could follow, like and share, as it helps other music lovers to find the show. I am also on YouTube. You can find me at the Indie Pop Girl podcast, and I'd be grateful if you could like and subscribe, as I'm creating content, shorts and posting teasers for upcoming episodes. You can also find me on TikTok at the Indie Pop Girl podcast if you want to give me a follow over there. There is a public Spotify playlist available, and I've added some of my favourite tracks from the artists and records covered on the podcast. This will be updated as the episodes drop, so if you are curious with any of the artists and albums that I have covered, please give it a listen, and who knows, you might find a new discovery. You can find me on Spotify at the Indie Pop Girl, and the playlist is called Favourite Tracks from Podcast Episodes. I'll be back very soon, and I'll be pausing the Indie Classics series just briefly to make way for the first new release drop of 2026. I'll be discussing a record from an artist who keeps on pushing the boundaries with genres and her artistry. This record will break out of the indie pop mould, but I am so excited for this new release, and I'll be teasing this once my copy of the vinyl has been delivered. Until then, I'm Rachel, the Indie Pop Girl. Thanks for listening, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.